Hi, welcome to tonight's meeting of Media Workers CV19 Crisis Group. And we'll be discussing this week, new media, what's the way forward? And we have some great speakers who will be making some introductory remarks, which will be followed by a couple of rounds of questions, because we want to hear from you about what we do in this new media environment. But what's the meeting about specifically? Well, anyone who's just seen Mr. Cummings' press conference, so-called, will be perplexed at the stubborn inability of the mainstream media to ask some pertinent questions, such as, if you have dodgy eyesight, why are you driving 30 miles in a car? Or, if your child, you want to keep your child safe, why lock them in a car for 6 hours with someone that's got COVID-19? Questions that weren't asked by our august media royalty at the lobby today, which speaks to the question of what is wrong with the mainstream media, which is where new media comes in. So we have Steve Walker, who's the editor, I think also the owner of the Skwawkbox, which I think we could describe as an avowedly left-wing take on what's going on in the world. Mike Simons is a journalist, spent many years, I believe, at Computer Weekly, where he was a news editor and many other places besides, and is also a sometime media analyst. So Mike will be giving us his words of wisdom on the subject. And also we have David Miller, who's an academic, and his latest book is tantalizingly entitled Deception, Coercion and Propaganda, the Sociology of Organised Persuasive Communication. And he's also the co-founder and co-director of the Public Interest Investigations, including the Spinwatch project. I hope I got that right, David. But before we hear from our speakers, we are going to hear from another Mr. Walker, this time Colin Walker, who's a parent in Sheffield, and is a campaigner against the premature widening of the reopening of schools before it is safe. And every week we try to have someone from the front line or someone from some aspect of this pandemic who's doing something in the real world to actually confront it and push it back, and actually to deal with some of the politics behind it, because everything is political and the policies of this government are extremely political, I would argue, and that's why we've actually formed this group in the first place, to speak some truth to power and to organise against what they are doing to us in this pandemic, we might argue. So before we go over to our speakers on new media, let's hear from Colin Walker, a Sheffield parent, about what they're doing.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary. Thank you to NUJ for the invitation to speak to this meeting. As Gary says, I'm a parent in Sheffield. Got a 9-year-old boy. Like many other parents, I'm very alarmed about the rush back to school next week for many of the year groups in primary schools. We want our kids to be back in school when it's safe to do so, properly learning, not the rudimentary homeschooling that I've been doing with great support from the local school. But we do need our kids to be safe. So we're, like most parents, I'm fully supportive of the teachers' unions 5 tests. This doesn't just impact on parents and the school staff and kids. It's an issue that the whole community needs to take up. It is impossible to ensure effective physical distancing in schools and to educate kids at the same time. This means that children and school staff are now being put on the front line to a far greater extent than they have so far. Schools don't have adequate levels of PPE for teachers and kids. It's inevitable that there will be a rise in the levels of infection as a direct result of this, both for teachers and other school staff and for children. And children, of course, do not exist in a bubble. They have families, they have parents who are key workers, they have vulnerable family members and grandparents who may live in their family, most of whom have spent many months now carefully socially distancing and self-isolating, unlike, as I mentioned earlier, Dominic Cummings. So the kids are being sent back now because I think, I firmly believe it's because the government wants to reopen the economy. It's business which is their priority, not our safety, not our kids' safety, not the education of the children. They want workers back at work. If it is safe, then the schools for the privileged, places like Eton, Windsor and Harrow, they'd be going back now too, but they're not going back because they don't believe it's safe. It's one standard for them and another one for the rest of us. I believe the government is still practicing the cruel herd immunity policy, where they want the disease to run right through society. The science of how kids catch and spread this coronavirus is not fully understood. The studies are contradictory. Our kids are being used like canaries in a coal mine. The lack of any testing and tracing infrastructure compounds this. Parents should be encouraged to support and organise campaigns against the headlong rush back to schools. But as I said, it's an issue for the whole community. So even if you haven't got kids, you're impacted as well. The government has to be forced to back down from this plan, and we should do as much as we can to support delaying this rush back to school. Thanks very much.
And the key flashpoint or flash day is the 1st of June. And we're told that primary schools should be going back even before the pandemic is fully under control and before we have any of the infrastructure of testing and tracing and isolation in place. So it's highly problematic and it's an invitation to a second wave, I would suggest. Okay, let's open up our meeting. New media, what's the way forward? And before I continue, I should mention that the Canaries' Carrie Ann Mendoza was meant to be speaking tonight, but for unforeseen circumstances, as they say, it can't be with us at this point. So perhaps we can get the Canary back at another point in time. So first, let's open with Steve Walker, editor of Skwawkbox, that people hopefully are familiar with. We'll say a few words about the position of the new media at the moment and vis-a-vis the mainstream and what the pandemic means given the threat to advertising and to the longevity of many of the titles that are out there at the moment. Steve.
Yes, well, I think it's the first thing to say is it's more essential than ever that the left media finds its way forward, whatever that's going to be. Certainly well, we're talking about new media, but I've covered it from a left-wing viewpoint. I think we're in a situation where, with one or two more or less honourable exceptions, the vast majority of the media are not really challenging. They're going through the motions of a challenge without really pressing home any points to expose what the government's up to. I entirely agree with Colin in his take on the schools, and I think that's one area where the media have been quite complicit and culpable in terms of pushing this notion that it's quite safe to go back and ignoring stories from other countries that say otherwise. And you know, I'll just say at the beginning, I can't really comment on the issues of advertising revenue, etc., because we don't advertise on the Skwawkbox, so it's not an issue that we've seen anything of. But I think it's, you know, from a political to media and a political situation. So the political situation is we haven't really got any kind of opposition that's really opposing at the moment. Most recent example probably being the failure of the Labour Party to call for Dominic Cummings to be sacked and the kind of active avoidance of that question when it's come up in interviews, etc. And then, you know, once everybody else is saying he should be sacked, then and Johnson doesn't, then suddenly saying, well, I would have sacked him if it had been me, is not really pushing home a point and trying to defend the people that we're supposed to be standing up for. So I think there's you know, that said, there's a few things that we need to be looking at. I mean, certainly from our point of view, we've seen a lot of bizarre things going on in terms of the social media movement, the traffic, etc. It can be very good one minute, drop it off the next, within the same article, you know, the same article being flying and suddenly go dead as things are clearly kind of cut off at some point. Twitter seems to have been particularly guilty of that recently. So I think that we need to find, as much as we can, ways of working together I think we saw this situation a little bit in 2017 in the wake of the general election then, when the establishment got really worried that the left-wing social media was working really well, and therefore they tried to find ways to stem that, the kind of reach and restrict what it could achieve. So we saw Facebook change its algorithms, we saw Twitter then do some strange things, and we saw Facebook do some more strange things and change how it was promoting its posts, etc. So we need to work more proactively together, I think, to cross-promote each other's material, to collaborate where possible. I think that need spreads out into the supporters of the new media as well. So the people who read and value what we put out should, as much as possible, be working on trying to make sure that their wider circle on their social media platforms gets to hear about it. But I think also there's a need for those media to work together to do a few things, more of a kind of televisual or Netflix / Amazon app type approach to putting out some of the material to make sure that people can access it easily, regardless of what Facebook and Twitter and anybody else are doing, and make sure that information gets out and has a channel to get out. And other ways of trying to kind of build platforms, social media platforms, whatever else it is, to allow a reach to be achieved that can't be tampered with by somebody who maybe has a personal investment in seeing the status quo maintained, etc. So those are my kind of broad strokes, really, as to things I think we need to talk about and plan a way forward. Don't want to go into too much detail on it, and let the discussion develop as it goes.
Thank you very much, Steve. I see that President Trump has set up a panel to investigate the anti-conservative bias of social media. We haven't noticed that much of that, but anyway, we might, from our point of view, say there's an anti-left-wing bias, as Steve was intimating to some extent there. Okay, let's widen it out a bit. And also, whilst we're on social media, share this on social media. Do start a watch party on Facebook, and share the Media Workers CB19 Crisis Group page and group, and indeed join the group. Okay, over to Mike, who'll give us a bit more analysis on what's been going on in the space and the venture capital that's been coming in that was behind the box.
No, stop there, Gary.
Media outlets. Anyway, I'm robbing what you're going to say.
No, I'm actually going to talk about new media and journalism and try and separate them out a little bit, because the question is, what's the way forward for new media? And I'm a absolute believer in embracing it. And I think the more oppositional you are in society, the quicker you need to embrace it. That's not to say I'm not aware of all the problems. So I'll say, well, look, we've always had new media. In the 20th century, we had offset LIFO, radio, television, desktop publishing, and the internet. Now we've got social media is the new addition to that. And I think as a journalist, as a filmmaker, you should always be on top of the media technology and understand what it can do and what we can use it for, how it can help journalists and activists organize, both in normal times and in extraordinary situations. So, I, for one, as a journalist, have hated web conferences and conference calls and all the rest of it, but we're now living on Zoom. So times change, technologies change, and they come to have a function. Look, new technologies create new platforms, and I think whenever there's a new platform, it allows a space for radical and critical voices to come through. And it does so either because we consciously move in quickly and rapidly into a newly developing sector, or it creates platforms that we can we can use. And we do need to be at the cutting edge, make the best use of what they've got to offer. And then the other thing, honestly, is it's just where the new jobs are. If you're a radical critical voice, you're more likely to find work in the media nearer the cutting edge. At the same time, the realities of the market are absolutely there. In my working lifetime, it's really been desktop publishing and online. You know, desktop publishing saw an explosion of print titles, new publishing houses, followed by a rapid contraction. Most of the major players from the past survived and they gobbled up the startups. And the same's true in the online and new media era. I worked, first of all, I worked on Socialist Worker, and then as a technology journalist, enterprise technology. It's a sector that absolutely boomed, but the innovative startups got crushed by a combination of the dot-com boom going bust and by the heavyweight industry giants moving in to the space. So now and that's been consolidated over the economic cycles of the 20 years since Y2K, since the year 2000. And, you know, just to give you one example, you think of a title like Wired, which is still meant to be a bit funky and new and whatever. It's owned by Condé Nast, which is about as old a publishing house as you're gonna get, and the same goes through the period. Of course, each tech wave throws up specific issues. I mean, one thing that bugs me particularly in enterprise tech publishing is venture capital houses all around, you know, pushing the startup culture, launching sites which are effectively pump and dump operations that will be really beyond the pale if it were in financial services, but they're not much more than that, and then closing down quickly. The other thing we've seen is the big technology companies becoming publishers themselves, enormous publishers in their own right, employing writers. Much of what they write is of value, but very limited value to an intended audience. And they're putting news sites out of the way. You know, the people who survived by doing the stuff that the advertisers and the industry wanted to buy you space to do news. Now there's less and less money going into that. So there's a paradox, right? More jobs for writers, but less space to be controversial, innovative, and less value on the content. I'm not going to talk much about Google and Facebook. They're parasitic. We talked about them last week with the NUJ's recovery plan, attacks on them. But if that just fits back into the existing media companies, it isn't the new media that we need. And I'm not going to say much about how nebulous some of the new media platforms can be when the powers that be decide enough. We've already heard about Google and Facebook and the algorithms, which are not designed to promote quality content, but to promote the partners of those media giants to get the people who accept the latest ad technology and the rest of it. It's just monopolistic business practice, which we saw in the browser wars. If you go back to the 1990s, you saw it in the newspaper wars, with back in the early 20th century. And then if you take another historic view, the algorithms and what's promoted and whatever is a very sophisticated form of censorship. It's not just a blanket ban on publishing and so forth. What's promoted and what isn't quite sophisticated. So you've got to, but if you know that, then you can begin to find strategies to deal with it. So I'd argue that platforms and technology really matter, and we should be up to date, but journalism matters more. And on this, I'm actually quite optimistic, not because, you know, Donald Trump's holding an investigation into the bias of social media platforms, or but because I don't have rose-tinted specs about the past. You know, there's always been a Laura Kuenssberg acting as a PR mouthpiece for the Tory party, or the powerful taking dictation from Johnson and Cummings or the likes. We've always had it was called a yellow press back in the day, attacking working class people, fueling racism, ignoring inequality and iniquity, promoting war and the rest of it. but that's always produced a backlash, a reaction, and part of that reaction is people who want to become journalists. You know, I look at, you know, one of my kids has become a journalist. It wasn't me regaling him with tales of lunchtime booze or lines of cocaine in the Groucho Club or what, all that nonsense that's there. It's always been about people coming into the industry or who are awkward, who they like digging around, they're oppositional, they like digging around into stuff they shouldn't be looking at. They actually believe that, you know, you should speak truth to power. And it's not just the people who come in and end up as writers, I think. You look at the PR industry, you look at people in sales, ad sales and whatever, in the media industry, they're people who are questioning. They might have trained as journalists, but they haven't been able to get in. So they're interested in journalism, and that's a big hope for the future. So what do we need to do for good journalism? Well, it was Karl Marx said the first freedom of the press is not to be in business, and that's one line to go down. And I think it's important. I've done that I did that for many years. You know, we did it on socialist work at Skwawkbox. I'm sure it's the same. The Canary and others. You rely on your supporters on subscription models. It's hard work. It's precarious. You're still accountable to your supporters because they provide you funding, but broadly they think like you, and your responsibility is to get the message out and convince more people. The platforms you operate on are often short-lived. You likely have holes in your shoes, but it's very, very worthwhile. The other thing is what I've argued before is get in where the expansion in the industry is and push the boundaries as far as you can go. Be on the awkward squad in your title, or if you can't be the cutting edge reporter, but you're on the production desk, be the one that covers their back. Try and push the whole title as far as you can to the publisher's unhappy. The advertisers feel they've got to be there because the readership like it. And I'm going to wind up on these two points. That's all very well, but we face immediate issues now in the crisis. I'll just say two things to do. One's join a union. I mean, I've always said to people, if you want to be a good journalist, you really want to rock the boat, then you've got to be in the union, because even the best editor and the best publisher will only back you as far as their libel insurance runs. And if they're really, really brilliant people, they'll have put another $5,000 aside in a rainy day fund that will buy you another couple of consultations with a lawyer. But after that, you're on your own, you and the union. And I've got lots of criticism of the NUJ, but the NUJ, for all its faults, does stand up for journalists and does back journalists who are taking on, who speak truth to power, and are trying to be silenced. But a much more important thing is the collectivity. Look, we know the tsunami of job losses is coming, and we need to resist that. Let's make sure that they don't sack half the staff when we go back to work, and we're left doing all the hard work. And let's think far wider than just journalists or the filmmakers. I think if anybody who touches content, whether you're in sales, advertising, ad tech, any form of production, needs to be in a union. You know, the wider the base of the unions within a workplace, the better protected the journalists are, the better work you can do, new media platform or whatever. And the last point is, as journalists, as new media, is be part of a movement that's oppositional in society. Don't stand above it and try just say I'm reporting on it. And that's not a call for crude propaganda. I've always thought if you're oppositional, you've got to take on the strongest arguments the other side have got and knock them down. If you can knock down their strongest case, the other stuff follows. But also, what's the point of being a journalist if you're not giving voice to people who fight against injustice? You're not digging out information that they need and presenting it in a way you're not making that they can use. You're not making bullets for them to fire. So be part of the community you live in write about that community. Brings us back to COVID and June the 1st. We know what they're going to do on June the 1st. The performance, the mainstream media, certainly the people who got invited to Downing Street did with Cummings today, will be repeated on June the 1st, or they'll be outside the schools going, oh, look, everybody's going back in. The National Education Union, the teachers who don't want to go in, they're lazy, they're this, they're that. Which side are you going to be on? You know, new media are old. It's always been a question, which side are you going to be on? And I know which side most everybody watching this is going to be on, but there you go. That's me. Done.
Thank you, Mike, for your polemic. And it kind of echoes what Ken Loach was saying last week in our little talk, talking about telling truth to power being a collective endeavour. So I'd urge people to ask their questions on the Facebook page whilst you're watching this, and also if you want to get more involved and come along to our Saturday coffee chat where we organise stuff in the various localities that people are and in the various parts of the media, trying to get ourselves organised. And so I'll just take our last speaker and get your questions firing in. And the last speaker is David Miller, who's an academic, who is also the author of Deception, Coercion and Propaganda, the Sociology of Organised Persuasive Communication, which means he's going to be saying some very interesting things. So hang around for David.
If we're talking about social media, of course, it's correct to say that when new technologies come along, there is space, and there's space for contests. And of course, we should be in there contesting where we can. The current position that we're in with new media, for some of the reasons that Steve's been talking about, it makes that very difficult, and is making that increasingly difficult for radical and independent media to cut through the algorithms. And that's a significant problem for all of the left, and will continue to be, and will mount as a problem. And so we need to have an alternative for that. We need to have left social media in a much more developed way, in addition to the things that we're saying. But part of the reason for this is that the algorithms are being adjusted on the grounds of action being taken with the social media companies by politically interested parties, by which I mean, of course, states and conservative socialists. So part of the reason why you have David Icke being deplatformed by Facebook the other week, and an attempt to intimidate Twitter into deplatforming him as well, is that there's been pressure on him by conservative movements. Now, let's be clear, I'm no fan of David Icke, but what's going on here is an attempt to legitimize the censorship of dissenting voices. And they start with David Icke, they'll be on Katie Hopkins next on the right, and then they'll go for the left. Of course, they asked Rachel Riley, when she went to see Twitter, asked for George Galloway to be removed from social media as well. And let's be clear, this is an attempt to make sure that the left, the whole Corbyn movement, is removed from social media to any significant extent. When I mentioned Rachel Riley, I'm of course referring to the fact that she's a patron of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which is a new Labour centrist, Starmer-connected organisation, which is attempting to make sure that we forget all about Corbyn, and in fact the Corbynite views don't get anywhere in relation to the algorithms, but also are actually deliberately and specifically censored from social media. Now, my own experience is not one you can generalize from, but I've been off Twitter for 3 months now because legal pressure was exerted on Twitter by a lobbyist in London to close my Twitter account down. I'm not allowed to tweet as a result. This is happening to a lot of people for a variety of reasons, and it happens because people are engaged in dissent, and in my case, in criticism of the British state and indeed of the actions of the Israeli state. So I want to raise that as an issue for social media, that it's not the open playground that it was to some extent before. It is increasingly being hedged about with censorship on the left, especially. Although, of course, it will be legitimized by, knocking off Tommy Robinson here or Katie Hopkins there. So there's that. But then the other question, of course, is that social media is used for the purposes of repression and of manipulation especially by the state, but also by conservative social movements. Now, let me give you the example of the Boris Bot Army. I don't know if you've come across this. If you look up the hashtag Boris Bot Army, you'll see some of this stuff. It started off with, as far as I'm aware, there may be some prehistory, with the attack on an SNP MP who got some vile Twitter pile-ons and threats and abuse because he was in favour of Scottish independence. And what seems to have been the case is that there's a bot army pursuing and defending Boris Johnson. And we can't tell. Sorry, my daughter's just arrived. we can't tell exactly who is doing the bot stuff in relation to Boris Johnson, but we can be suspicious and we can conjecture about that. A second example in relation to that is the recent example during COVID of the tweet about the media misjudging sorry about that. So misjudging the mood of the nation. Now that thing, which is famously retweeted without being cited by Alan Sugar, clearly was the bots involved in that, whether they originated it or not, they certainly were involved in acting as a megaphone for that theme about the media being too critical of the government. Now, we don't know exactly who's behind these things, but we do know that the British government is engaged in procuring bot armies, and in fact runs bot armies through its own organisations. I don't know if you recall at the press conference a few days or a couple of weeks ago that one of the people giving the press conference was in military uniform, the Chief of the Defence Staff. And he mentioned that the British government was now looking to support in its media operations to the 77th Brigade. People, I don't know if you've heard of the 77th Brigade, but it's a new regiment of the British Army, which has been referred to in The Guardian as the Twitter troops of the British Army. This is a part of the British Army which is incredibly secretive, which has its own Twitter account, which never tweets. And so if it is engaged in social media, this is entirely covert, i.e. they're engaged in using social media through fake accounts or real accounts which are not admitting their connection to the 77th. Now, the fact that the 77th is engaged in, what shall we say, managing social media in relation to COVID-19 is in itself a massive political scandal. It shouldn't be involved at all in managing British public opinion. That's against the rules, always has been, but now it is involved in doing that. I imagine that some of this stuff that we're seeing about bots in relation to criticism of the government will be coming from the British military. Now that is an incredible thing to be saying. I mean, but yet, of course, nobody says this in the mainstream media. Nobody raises this as an issue. So that there's a problem here, which is that the direct involvement of the state in manipulating and managing political debate. And the last point I would want to make also relates to the state, and indeed also to allied movements to the state, conservative social movements especially, and that is in relation to trolling and the assault that there has been on the left since Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party has been unprecedented. Everybody knows this. The attack on Corbyn for anti-Semitism was the weapon of choice, but of course there were other allegations put against Corbyn early on that he was incompetent or that he was a misogynist or any of the other things that we know which were entirely false, but which were put by his enemies in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party. Now, this trolling involves social movements outside the state, but it also involves some relationship with the state, and it has been relentless in trying to attack and destroy the lives, jobs, and careers of anyone who supports a vaguely social democratic left-wing alternative to neoliberalism, that is, i.e. Corbynism. And so people have been sacked from their jobs, they've had, people have been deselected as MPs, people have been taken off Twitter or social media. There's a huge number of people now who've been attacked by the trolls and have had very significant personal consequences as a result. And that's one of the things which social media is enabling. Now, to finish off, just to come back to the social media companies and that, Twitter itself has a panel of organizations which advise it on who it should remove from its platform. And you can look this up, it's on their website. In particular, it's looking for people who can advise it in relation to hate and racism and the like. So there are organizations there which deal with homophobia, as well as some which deal with some aspects of racism, but there's no actual real anti-racist campaigns there. There are lots of pro-Israel campaigns, certainly, and campaigns that deal with anti-Semitism who can't tell the difference between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, but there are no genuine anti-racist campaigns. And so we can see the direction that some of this is going, is that there are organizations that are openly advising Twitter to remove people from Twitter who happen to be critical of the state of Israel or who are in any way signed up to something which might be contained within the description of Corbynism. So I'm less optimistic than the last speaker, and I think these are all real significant problems, and that we don't know nearly enough about them. We need to be investigating them. Yes, of course, we need to be based in communities and describing the struggles of communities, but we also need, in order to speak truth to power, to investigate the people who hold the power and who exert power over us and put us in the positions that we find ourselves in, and that is to tackle state and corporate power and the conservative movement itself. And we can't do that if we pretend or don't know that the kinds of things which I've been suggesting are happening.
Thank you, David. I think you'll get a bit of a debate going there, because I think Michael's seeing more opportunities than you're seeing in the social media space. And one figure I saw was that 15% of the accounts on Twitter are fake or run by bots. But it's quite similar on Facebook. Between 5 and 20% of the accounts on Facebook are fake, as in not a real person behind them, so they're controlled by somebody else. But these are all questions we need to address. And we have some questions coming in from our watchers. So carry on sharing this discussion and launching the watch parties. So our first question for our speakers comes from Julia. Whose side are you on has always been the question, but also can we find space to contribute to that debate? Does new media make more space for that? I think that speaks to what Mike and David were just talking about. Next question, I'll take 3 together. Hopefully you've got pen and paper to hand or keyboard. Should social media news sites be regulated by government? Right, obviously we'll open a can of worms, how they would regulate them. And thirdly, how do you see taxing social media giants like Google could fund public service journalism? So how could taxing social media giants like Google fund public service journalism? Right, so let's take it from the beginning. So let's start with Steve from Skwawkbox. Steve, do you want to have a go at any of those?
Well, the second one was interesting, but I'm not sure which way to understand the question. It says about should they be regulated, social media news sites be regulated by government? Does that mean the news sites or the social media? I'm not sure which way around that was, but let's assume it means the sites like mine. Mine is regulated, but not by the government directly. In the sense, I subscribe to Impress, which is the Leveson compliance regulator, and that's a blessing and a curse, a two-edged sword, so to speak, because very often I disagree with their judgments on stuff quite dramatically, but you know, it does have more credibility to it and add credibility to the content of the site, and is in some ways a shield against the almost non-stop attempts to paint what I do as fake news when it's inconvenient to the powers that be, because the level of regulation on that and the level of actual accountability for what we put out is considerably higher than would be in the case of a mainstream publication with Ipsa, etc. On the first question, I think whose side am I on? I think that's fairly clear, and you know, very much mine is about fighting for the ordinary person, for want of a better phrase, and for the Labour member ordinary person in particular, but certainly on a wider basis across society. So I think that's been essential, certainly to what I've done. I'm certainly not one of those people who tries to just, you know, give a he says, she says kind of version of the news like you hear on the BBC, with an emphasis on the wrong he and she sometimes. And you know, so I get accused sometimes of being an activist, you know, masquerading as a journalist. I think it's both. I think a journalist trying to actually achieve something for the sake of people who maybe don't have a voice very easily for themselves. Can't comment really on the other one. I mean, I think generally people should pay taxes, but I'm not a tax expert, so I don't know quite how that would work in the case of social media companies. So. Yeah,
sure. Thanks, Steve. Mike, do you want to have a go at those three?
I'll have a go at some of it. I think new media does open up space for debate, but as David showed very clearly, and as we know from our day-to-day practice, that space is being curtailed, closed down, moved. But new media as a general concept, right? Twitter and Facebook are old, you know, they're 15 years old now, and new things are opening up. I mean, Steve was quite interesting early on, saying about we need a kind of left alternative networks and whatever. Quite how that works, I'm not sure. My son-in-law is a software developer, web developer. He's convinced that in 20 years' time, 40% of software in the world is going to be open source. You know, there are other things coming on, but what I'm concerned about is we fight where we are. We're reasonably optimistic about what we're doing, and we don't get too obsessed with the technologies that are current. They've always tried to curtail. We've always fought to get control. They've always tried to curtail, and that's the battle. Should there be some regulation of new media? Well, I'm like everybody else. I'm absolutely opposed to censorship, but equally, I'm absolutely opposed to racism and fascists having a free reign. So maybe probably yes, but some sort of control, of social and community control, but how you do that, it's always going to be a failure. And should we tax the online giants? Yes, on two levels. One, people should pay tax, and two, as a journalist, one of the worst things about online is being ripped off. There's absolutely being ripped off, and no one rips you off more than Google and Facebook, who are completely parasitic on your content. So yes, there should be tax. Yes, that money should be fed back into journalism and into public sector journalism, public interest journalism. But always when states doling out money for public interest journalism, there are problems with it. I would not be very keen on Google being taxed to give the money to Reed Elsevier, even to the Guardian and whatever. So there are inherent problems. It doesn't mean building our own media. It doesn't mean there's no need to build our own media, but yes, there should be tax. I'm done.
Cheers, Mike. Okay, David, like to tackle those three questions, or any part thereof?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm in favour of media regulation. The media, the public service media in this country are already regulated, as perhaps everyone who's listening to this knows. I mean, the broadcasters, Laura Kuenssberg and Robert Peston, who we saw this evening, lobbing grenades at Dominic Cummings, not, that they are bound by law to exhibit due impartiality in their reporting. Now, it's always been the case since the very beginning of the BBC that the BBC has been biased in favour of the powerful and indeed of the ruling class conceived more broadly. From the famous note in the first Director General's diary at the time of the general strike, when the government decided not to take over the BBC, and this is the most famous quote of any media studies course, which is, you know, he wrote in his diary, the government know that they can trust us not to be really impartial, and that's been the practice ever since. But I think that what's happened since the sort of market pressures on public service broadcasting is that the BBC and ITN have got worse at holding power to account. They didn't ever hold power to account effectively, but there were spaces for power to be held to account. That's why the Thatcher government wants to get rid of Panorama and Dispatches and all those programs, which occasionally, you had Jeremy Paxman filming Irish Republican Army volunteers patrolling in armed patrols in South Armagh. You had Thames Television doing an investigation of the Gibraltar shootings, concluding that the 3 IRA volunteers in Gibraltar had been shot dead without being warned that they were going to be shot. So there were spaces which were created by public service broadcasting which have been systematically closed down. And since the Blair government, since the attack on the BBC over the Iraq war, it's become even worse. And so I think people are right to say Laura Kuenssberg is appalling. I mean, she's way worse than broadcasters were in the 70s and 80s when they were biased in favour of the government, right? But it's way worse now, I think, and that there's particular reasons for that. There's particular politics, and it's to do with the market system, etc. Let's not detain ourselves with that. So, should there be regulation? Yes, there should be, and the BBC and the ITN should be bound to exhibit due impartiality. I think that the press should be too, and that social media could easily be brought into public interest and public service broadcasting. Now, to democratise the media institutions, how do we do it? Well, we democratise them. We make them susceptible to democratic accountability and control. Not difficult to do. In principle, it would, of course, as with every policy advanced by a Corbyn-led Labour Party, would kick up a huge fuss amongst the people in power because they don't want to share power and they don't want to do things differently. They want their chums from the public schools to be able to get the jobs in journalism or in Whitehall or in government that they've been having for some time now, and they don't want to go back to the situation in the 70s and 80s where they were challenged in those hierarchies. So it's very possible to regulate in the public interest, but it requires government to be able to do that, and it requires also a democratization of our media institutions. Should we tax the social media giants? Obviously, but the more important question, though, which none of this argument about regulation touches, is the question of the role of the secret state, especially in the manipulation of the media, which would not be touched by public service regulation, except in the sense that there would be a wider space for criticising the intelligence services and the military, etc., who effectively run large parts of how our society operates. So that seems to me to be a key question, which I think social democracy never was able to understand or cope with. If you look at the experience of the Labour governments from 45 right up to the new Labour governments of the 90s and the noughties, they were never able to deal with those kinds of questions. And indeed, of course, that was because they were never able to deal with questions of imperialism. The Labour Party has always been, throughout its life, a pro-imperialist party and has done very badly in dealing with questions of imperialism and colonialism back then and indeed now. That was challenged to some extent by the Corbyn-led party, but we haven't got a way of dealing with that on the left, which is effective and which would be effective at present in terms of the debates that we currently have. So there's something else which needs to be dealt with, and that could be dealt with in relation to social media too, because it could mean that you don't let certain states, in particular the British state and the American state, but also, let's be clear, the Israeli state have more power than other states in both in international affairs and indeed in regulating or intimidating or harassing social media.
Thank you very much, David. And we come to our next four questions. And we have 10 minutes left. So let's do a quick round. Right, newspapers have been allowed to conceal circulation figures during CV19 crisis. Does that indicate the beginning of the end of print media? Didn't know they were allowed to conceal their circulation figures. Was it social media and the mainstream working together what done it? I think that's a Sunism for Dominic Cummings. Third question, do you agree with Orwell that during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act? That could be a quick answer, I guess. And fourth and last question, what's the future of investigative journalism? Which I think we've kind of sort of touched on. Okay, let's go back up the order and start with Steve. Would you like to have any of those?
Yeah, I mean, a quick comment on any of those. I mean, the circulation figures, I think it's not good that they're allowed to conceal those. I don't think in any case, though, that they spell the beginning of the end, whether that's a good or bad thing, because you know, some of their circulations moved onto online platforms as well as into the print versions. So the print figures are not the be all and end all of everything. It's probably still a big part of how they make their money, and in some cases, them struggling to do that wouldn't be a bad thing. In terms of Cummings, I'm not sure he is done for yet. We'll see. In the old days, I think he would have been gone days ago, but nowadays they're just brazen it out. And you know, I remember when Jeremy Hunt was accused of passing information to Murdoch about the Sky News bid and the Monopolies Commission, etc. He was, you know, most people would have expected him to resign at that point, and in the end, he got promoted to Health Secretary. So we live in strange times, which leads on to the third question of the Orwell, and that's actually the tagline on my site. So yes, I definitely think it's a revolutionary act, and it's incumbent on us all to try and do that. Future for investigative journalism. Speaking from my own point of view, I think a large part of that has become it's become a kind of collective or collaborative effort in a lot of ways, because I think that you know, a lot of the newspapers now can't or don't want to spend the money on proper investigative journalism, where they take time to look into things and, you know, build cases and articles, and certainly I haven't got the money to do it. However, because of a certain kind of reach that we have and you know, profile that people are aware of, a lot of times other people are doing that work on a particular area of interest to them, or one that they're personally involved in, and then come in either as, you know, their own investigative journalists on a kind of solo scale, or as whistleblowers to people like me or the Canary or other people, who we can then start doing some fact checking on what they bring in and do the due diligence and bring that stuff out to people. So in some cases I act more as a mediator, if you like, or a you know, middleman between the people that have dug up the information and getting it out to readership, because it's not feasible for a smaller operation to go off and investigate every individual thing personally in depth. So you've got to take an overview, like an editor job, if you like, on that, but feeding material through to people that you've been able to verify, but won't have necessarily done all the spade work on yourselves, because the resources don't permit it.
Cheers, Steve. I should just add in that someone's, I think Shirley Franklin was asking about Buzzfeed, and could our speakers explain what happened at Buzzfeed? People don't know the UK operation's been shuttered. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that, Steve, in particular. There's a rare example of so-called quality output. They did some good investigations. They even teamed up with the BBC. I'm not sure if that's a good sign or not, but they've gone under. So what does that tell us, perhaps?
I haven't decided yet. I've been too busy looking at other things really to dig into what was behind that, but it looks more like a corporate decision, whether that's because they were a bit too effective and not answerable enough to their kind of US parent company or whatever. I'm not sure, but for whatever reason they've decided it's not in their interest anymore to have a UK arm. And I can think of people I'd rather it had happened to than BuzzFeed, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Mike, like to come back on those questions, or just one or two of them if you don't want to do all?
I think the Buzzfeed thing, I think it's a sign of what's to come if we let them get away with it, which is a massive set of job losses in the industry. Now we really do have a fight on our hands. Yeah, can't say more than that. On newspapers and circulation, I don't care, to be honest, whether they publish the figures or not, because they're defrauding the advertisers. You know, the figures are published for the advertisers. Effectively, the figures have been fiddled for years. You know, they can't, all the stuff they give away at an airport as a sale. So whatever. I care about the jobs, and I still quite like print, but I've worked online since 1998, almost exclusively online. I think online's a great medium. I think we can get rid of Cummings. You know, I don't think mainstream press and social media did for Cummings, but the mainstream press did dig the story out. They could have done a lot more with Cummings a lot earlier, but they did dig the story out. And I think the way we've pushed it and the way we use it and the way we use it in all kinds of networks using social media is very, very helpful. But if we don't keep the pressure up, and if they manage to turn it into, divert attention and turn on the National Education Union and the rest of it, Cummings might stagger through. But at times there's such profound crises in society that people can't stomach the lies. You can't fool all the people all the time, and that's what they're trying to do with Cummings. You know, you look at some of the things that Tory MPs have been saying, some of the letters that they've had in. There is a deep groundswell. So let's get a scalp. You know, we can still really go for a scalp. All we're talking about telling truth as a revolutionary act. We're talking this has been a very far left platform. I know lots of great journalists, really great journalists, who tell the truth, who are very far from revolutionary, but they can't they can't understand why they tell the truth and nothing changes. So it's an interesting thing. You tell the truth, you get the stuff out there, and then you try and relate it to a movement that can make a change. And what's the future for investigative journalism? It's always been tough. It's a bit tougher, but it's there. There's always stuff to investigate. There's always help you can give people. There's always people wanting to talk, and it's always been a collaborative thing. You know, I was tutored by Paul Foote. Where did Paul Foote get his stuff from? He didn't get it. You know, it wasn't a stroke of genius. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of contacts, a lot of people feeding into him, and that's what journalism's always been. I don't like one of the things that's gone on with the new media world. You've got to be a personality. You know, it's all about self-promotion as a journalist. It's one of the downsides, but actually, proper investigations are going to be there. Yes, they're expensive. Yes, they're hard. Often the bosses don't want to let you do it, but stuff comes out. We find ways. We've got to keep finding ways, but we do find ways of making a difference. That's me.
Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, over to David Miller.
Yeah, I don't agree with that about truth. You can tell truth all you like. You can tell truth all you like to the powerful. It depends on whether you can attach those truths to social movements who can make a difference. Now, we've just gone through the period of all of our lives where we had the highest chance of doing that, and whoever was responsible, we failed. And so, the mundane question remains, who cares about your truth? Nobody cares about your truth unless you can make it count. And the people who care at the top about those truths only care about those truths when they can be made to count. And that's what's happening now with Cummings. It's being made to count. Those Tory MPs who are mocking and feigning outrage on the radio don't care about this, but they care that the people who elected them care about it. And that's where it starts to pinch. It's when the powerful are forced into the position that we can make a difference to them, that's when they care. And that only happens in the kind of system we have, rarely, unless there's a mass mobilization to do that. Cummings is kind of on the ropes here. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes. If he makes it through, it will be an utter miracle. I mean, to have, what is it, only 3 Tory MPs now batting for him, I saw that somewhere, is an extraordinary feat of political carelessness and arrogance. But the truth doesn't set you free. The truth is it only sets you free, and I would say this in relation to Paul Foot as well, in the context of an analysis which can be made to count. And Paul had the analysis to go along with the painstaking compilation of the facts that he did in his many fantastic stories. Now, I wish that there was more of that. I mean, I know that there's a lot of investigative journalism out there which is funded by foundations and the like. Some of it which seems to be wanting to do investigative journalism to support power rather than to tell truth to power, i.e. Doing investigative journalism to lie for power rather than to tell truth to power. And I wish there was more of the investigative journalism which tried to subvert powerful institutions and organizations who hold illegitimate power and who are not responsive to democratic mechanisms, even although they're supposed to be. And the question about the in that quote, the Orwell quote about universal deceit. Well, we live in a period where deceit is much more likely and much more significant than it was before. In the period between 1945 and, I would say, the middle of the new Labour governments, civil servants were required not to lie. And then the Blair government abolished that requirement. And still we have the case, we still do have civil servants left in Whitehall who will, at pain of their jobs being lost, tell the truth, as we saw with that tweet yesterday. The truth twisters, can you imagine what it's like to work with these people? There still are people, of course, in Whitehall who have respect for the truth, but they're not required by means of their contract to tell the truth. And so we have, in the neoliberal period, we have an increasing likelihood and liability of state operatives to lie to us. And so that's a historical process, and we can only reverse that and go back to a period of non-universal deceit when we democratize the whole apparatus.
Thank you very much, David and Steve from Skwawkbox, and Mike, media analyst. And that was a very illuminating discussion. Hope you can still see me. And let me tell you about next week's meeting, which has an international flavour, reporting COVID-19, an international view. One of the striking things about this global pandemic has been the national responses. So the Brits ignore anything everyone else in the world says because we are the Brits, and we invented public health policy. Well, actually, working class people fought for it, so there's no big we about it. But anyway, that's another story. And also the question of the virus itself and how we fight that. We're going to need a vaccine. And again, nationalism gets in the way, and all the different companies competing 100 different efforts instead of pooling their resources. Also, all those sorts of questions are brought into view with our next meeting, which features Mccann. Speaking of investigative journalists, he's certainly one, and he's also the author of War in an Irish Town, which I remember reading back in 1980. An eye-opener about the north of Ireland. Nina Lakhani, environmental justice correspondent at The Guardian, US, and also author of Who Killed Berta Cáceres. And Rihad Desai, who is a South African-based producer and director, in particular Miners Shot Down, which came out in 2014 about the Marikana massacre of miners in South Africa, a riveting film. The Bushman's Secrets, and also Everything Must Fall, another brilliant film. So you can catch all of them next week, Monday, the 1st of June. So when we've all come from protesting about the attempt to open the schools by the Tory government, we can get along to that meeting at 7 p.m. at the same place, which was the Facebook page of Media Workers CV19 Crisis Group. So thanks again to our speakers, Mike, Steve and David, and to our guest parent campaigner who spoke at the beginning. Thanks for viewing, and see you next week. And go and join the Facebook group and get involved. Thank you.